Hello and welcome to the Left In podcast. I'm here with Ana.
Hello.
And we got onto the subject of feminism in a way, to the idea that when feminism first started, it was like, do women want equality with men in the way that the world is? And what that's resulted in is that there has been some degree of equality, that women have the same opportunities to get the same jobs in the same basic hierarchies and structures. So a lot of women have discovered that the way men treat each other in the workplace is not very nice. So getting to be treated equally doesn't mean being treated well. And it's like, is this all that we can aspire to? Is like more competitive hierarchy way of life that is kind of miserable for most people. So like, what is an ideal that we actually would aspire towards? What is worth building towards or fighting for? Is that a good statement of the question? Or you thought about
yeah,
it?
I think it is in a general way, because your question, like the situation that you're thinking, you have in mind right now, it's focused on the working environment.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, like the whole point of what we have been discussing is in life in general.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think is that we should give it like a bigger look, obviously, because it isn't just about the working conditions. I think it's about the way you carry your life and the way society sees you and how they value you, like how much value do they give you as a human being. I think that's the whole point, and that would be the ideal, what we were discussing before. I think that it's like, as human beings, we have the same essence, to say it in that way. So we should be able to access everything as equals. Health, job, life opportunities, like to have the same options in everything.
Free time, etc.
Yeah.
Leisure time. How people value each other as people, and also how we're each empowered to be able to have agency and make choices about what we do with our lives, like throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like even the idea of work being that somebody else owns your time for most of the day is kind of weird.
No, it's another. I think that's another bigger topic that we could discuss in another because it's big. So yeah, I think it's education, work, but mostly the way that others see you
and value you.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I thought of it in terms of feminism is part of what I think has been discovered, particularly by feminist scholars since the 60s, is how systematically undervalued certain kinds of work were and are. That they, it's not like women just weren't working at all before 1967. But the kinds of work, a couple of the scholars have started calling it caring work. Like the things that you do to help other people exist and do what they do. All of us have to take care of ourselves, and then we take care of the people around us. That means making sure, that someone has their coffee ready when they're getting up in the morning, or their lunch made if they're a kid going to school, or like we think about the economy in terms of like dishes are something that's produced, manufactured, but really a dish is completely worthless unless you clean it. Otherwise, you use it once, and then it's got a nice crust on it of gross something, and you're never going to use it again. So the caring work of maintaining this stuff that has been produced is really 99% of the value of your dishes is because you keep washing them so you can use them again. So that's the kind of work that traditionally has fallen on women, is taking care of things, taking care of each other. And a lot of men just didn't see that. It was like a giant blind spot of like most economists, like Karl Marx and everything through up until like pretty recently, as economists just thought of like physically manufacturing things was real work. Manufacturing cars and, solar panels and whatever. Like the value came from making the thing. But now that we're moving into like a world where most things are finance or service, we're discovering that actually making things is only a tiny part of what goes on. A huge part of the value comes from taking care of the things, taking care of each other. And then it sort of folds back on itself. Like only a tiny bit of our time and effort is made into producing the things that we need. Producing the food and shelter and whatever, and everything else is like maintaining it or consuming it. And like we really have enough abundance that we all could have enough to eat and share it, but instead we've managed to make it that we all still have to work full time. I mean, not all of us and not all of the time, but most people, if you don't work full time, you start falling into debt, and you can't, because like the basic overhead level of costs to just get by is so high that it's like you have to work. And then within that, it's like women won the wrong half of the equality battle. Women won the right to like get a job that's out there in the world, in an office and in production and manufacturing and whatever, but didn't get valued for the other kinds of work
we're doing.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
So you have to work both, get paid less.
I'm thinking about this meme I saw, I don't know when, but a while ago, and it said something like, you have like this executive woman, like CEO, and she's saying like, if someone would have told me that this was so hard, I would have stayed at home cooking. So I read it, and it kept me like thinking about like, is this the message that if I were a really an office hardworking woman, I would like to give to the others and to the fight of the women's rights. But I think it connects with what you're saying. They are very hard things that we have to do, but if we're talking about equality, and if you are saying that guys were going through that before, I think that sometimes they're surprised for what you want in life.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's bad that we have now to go through that, but that's how it is. So I think that in terms of working conditions, the focus should be about looking at those working conditions and make them better for both genders. Is that the word?
Genders.
And that's good, because like in a way you can think of, okay, let's team up and fight for them, instead you as a man trying just to go in and have better working conditions. On that matter, that's how I feel like, because if we are seeing each other as equals, I see you as a partner or someone as the same level that we can go and fight things or look for things and see each other like, okay, you can help me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it.
As opposed to this kind of like extracting surplus value. Like, oh, okay, you'll help me do my business, but you'll make less money than I make off of the time that you are putting in.
Well, and that's another
classic
thing.
Capitalism.
That's a weird thing, because I've been working since I was 18 years, and the first time I heard that women were making less money than guys, it was when I was in college, about to finish, and I didn't know that, because most of the people around me, well, like my family, we are mostly women, and they all work, and I never heard one of them saying, okay, I'm making less money than this guy who's at the same level as me. So I don't know if that's something that it's happening like in other countries, and it's
it might be different in Colombia than in...
Yeah, I'm not saying that it is not different here. I'm just saying that in my context and what I've seen, I have never seen it. So I felt like I was ignorant to that situation. So what I've heard about is that sometimes it happens, like you can see a bigger difference the higher the level of the position in the company is. But I was working in HR I did it for like 3 companies,
mm-hmm.
and I never saw that difference until the last one that I was in, and it was a doctor position,
Medical.
medical. I worked in this. We used to do like the examinations for workers who were about to enter a company.
Okay.
And when they're leaving the company, we would take their test and examination to see if their health is at the same as the time they entered. So we were looking for a doctor with this very specialized education about like, I don't remember the word in English, but it's about the kind of diseases you might have when you're working. So they were asking me to fill that position, and I remember that they said if it's a guy, if it's a man, he was making 1 million more than the woman, and I thought, oh my god, is this really
1 million pesos.
happening?
Just
Yeah.
to be clear, a peso is about 3,000 American dollars.
Yeah,
So
that's when I.
it's a significant difference in Colombia, but it's not $1 million. That would be a little more.
Yeah, that's very important. So that's the first time I saw it happen, and then I thought, should I go to the manager and ask him about it, like what's going on?
So one of your managers told you that, and
Yeah.
then you thought about going to another manager and asking.
Yeah, like, can you please tell me about this? Because I was thinking, I can't believe this is what everyone is talking about and this is happening here. And I would like to do something about it. So I remember that I had to manage the conversation, like, just to let them know that I was just being curious
yeah.
and not just questioning them. And
Because you were afraid if you asked too powerfully, you might lose your job. Like if
Yeah.
you say this sounds like bullshit to me.
So I had
you
to
were
be
afraid
like
to say that.
careful about it. And I did, and they never gave me like a full answer about it. Like, yeah, that's how it is.
Well, I'm curious. Like, I've actually read that there is not a big difference in salaries between men and women when you do a sort of bigger analysis, meaning like when men and women do the same jobs in ways that are measurable, like a certain level of, you know, accountant or manager or doctor in a big company where everything is, you know, written, that men and women actually make the same money in most of the Western world, supposedly. But overall, women still make less money than men. They usually quote the number 77 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And if you just look at like the total amount of money men make in salaries versus the total amount of money that women make, it might be about that 77 cents. But part of that is because women very often drop out of a career track to become mothers, which in some cases can be a positive choice, but it means rather than getting continuously promoted like the man does, you drop out for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. And even when you come back, maybe you don't look for the 90-hour-a-week
You can't. There's no
lawyer partner job. Exactly.
Yeah.
So part of it is explained by
Context.
that context, is that men stay continuously on a career track in a way that women don't. And the other is that, and this is especially true in countries like Scandinavia, which have done a huge amount of work at making it equal opportunity and free for women to do whatever jobs they want. And everybody gets free education. And what they found there is that women are, and again, you can look up these statistics, there's some debate about them, but it's even more so since they passed some of these equality laws, is that women choose fields that make less money. They become caring professions, teachers, therapists, these sorts of things, whereas men disproportionately choose to go into a field like engineer, doctor, whatever. I'm not sure exactly which fields it is, but so higher paid fields, if more men go into higher paid fields and more women go into lower paid fields, then overall women are going to make less money, even though they're not getting discriminated against necessarily.
But according to what you're saying, there shouldn't be like a fight for fair wages, because if one, I'm not getting a fair wage because of my choosing of my career, and second, because I'm stay-at-home mom. Like, who am I gonna
fight against?
Yeah, there's no way.
Right, so there is an argument to be made that there actually is equality in those senses, and if we want to look for justice or fairness, we have to think about things on a bigger level than just what do you make for what job. That might actually be more fair than we might have thought. I mean, personally, my experience has been that there is some difference, but it's also not necessarily because of discrimination. Like, I had a job as a pool director at a summer camp. I was like 22 or I don't remember how old, something like that. And when I got the job, the director of the summer camp drove a hard bargain. And I got a job offer at another summer camp, and so I was like, well, no, if you don't pay me this much, I'll go take the job at the other camp. And I wasn't afraid of them saying no. If they said no, I'd go take the job at the other camp. So I made, I don't know, this was a while ago, so it was like $2,200 for the summer was what we agreed on. And about halfway through the summer, I started talking with the other people who worked there, the other men who were also lifeguards and pool director. I was the only pool director, but then there was like a guy who was there was a woman who was the waterfront director, which was sort of the same position as my position. And just the ordinary counselors, the men counselors and the women counselors for the boys and the girls at the camp. And what we found was that consistently the women were making several $100s less than the men for the same jobs. But when you dug a little deeper and you said, okay, wait, I'm curious about this. How did the negotiation go? Almost all the women said to me, what negotiation? Like, they got offered a salary and they took it. And almost all the men said, well, yeah, I knew what I was worth, and so I said I want to be paid more, this. And the camp directors mostly, gave in to that. But the men had a certain degree of confidence. Maybe they were socialized that way, brought up to think that they're worth more, brought up to be more comfortable asking other people what they make. So I'm making $2,200, and the woman who's running the waterfront's making $1,700. And the counselors are making, the lifeguards are just making, the men are making $1,500 or $1,200, and the women are making $1,000. And then just the ordinary counselors, some of the women counselors were making as little as $500 for the whole summer. And the men were making $900. But it was clear that the camp directors were going to pay whatever they could get away with paying everybody. It wasn't about the genders of the people. But that's how it played out, was that the women were making a lot less money than the men. So you could still argue, it's not discrimination on the basis of the sex of the people.
Actually, that's the same thing that happened at the office. I was friend to one of the female doctors. I obviously had access to all this information, so I found a way to let her know that she was making less money, and it was close to her like each year you can have increase in your wage.
A raise, yeah.
Yeah, a raise. So I found a way to let her know, okay, you should negotiate and ask for this amount because
it's fair.
I know you can ask for it, and I know that it's fair, and that you should be receiving that amount of money. And I also pressured my bosses, this is time, she has been here long enough, and I think they all should be making the same amount. So it's something that I had to slowly work on it, but so I had to help her. And then that's what she did. She's also a very feisty woman. She knows her worth, but she didn't know there was a difference. I didn't exactly have to tell her, but I was like, you should do something about your wage. So it's the same thing.
But when you did that, did your bosses find out that you helped her?
No, because she's feisty. They knew that she.
They knew that she might find out.
Yeah, anyway. No, not that she told him that. I know that. No. She was like, okay, this is time. I'm making this amount of money. I have been making it for this amount of time. So I think this is the time when you should give me more for what I do. I know my worth here, because she used to say that all the time in that work. I know my worth. I know my position. I know how much you need me here. So let's negotiate. But what you're saying is, and after that I thought, is this what happens in the company? There's difference, but they don't know it, and they should negotiate more. And I don't know if it's about education because she's a woman that I thank her for a lot of things, and she was a model to me because from her I learned that sometimes you need to know your worth and fight for it.
Mm-hmm.
So even though she's feisty, she didn't know that she was still being treated in a
unfair way.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting there too, so when that happened at that summer camp, once we talked about it a bunch of the women got together and went to the camp directors and said we should be making more money, and they used my name. They said, oh, well, he said he's making this much, and he said some of the other men are making this much, and most of the other men didn't want to overtly, and I didn't want to get into a fight. I thought it was open. I didn't know it wouldn't be public knowledge, you know, and they tried to shame me into saying like, what you did by sharing your salary information was like almost like impolite. Like, why would you do that? Like, that's just like, you shouldn't ask other people what they make. That's rude. And I was like, but you're using the fact that we're all too polite to ask each other against us. Like, you only paying me this much because I drove a hard bargain. Like, it's not fair. I know that at some of the bigger companies, it's much more transparent. You can tell by somebody's job title what they make. And maybe there's a little bit of like flexibility about like a bonus or something at the end of the year, how much money you make. But generally, bigger companies become more standardized. Like in the federal government, it's like if you're at a certain grade, everybody knows how much money you make. You have a certain amount of years of seniority. If you're like a policeman or something, everybody can look up. It's like public record. They know how much money you make. So that might be fairer. But when you look at, you know, how the free market works, if you're, and I've been on the other side of it, I've been the entrepreneur offering people jobs, you know, raising money. And it's like, if I have to pay people as little as possible to accomplish the goal because I don't have enough money to accomplish the goal. That's like the definition of entrepreneurship, right? Mm-hmm. And you've done some entrepreneurial projects too. You've been on the side of financing projects and whatever. And it's like, on a certain level, you have to try to get as much done with as little money as possible, right?
Yeah.
So you could say that in the bigger picture, if companies don't treat their employees fairly or aren't transparent about how much money they make, eventually people will find out and then they'll move to another company, right? So the free market should theoretically adjust for this, right? But most people aren't like as rational as the free market would like us to be. You know, that if we all were like purely just deciding what's the best value for where I'm going to spend my time and work, well, then we'd be able to move anywhere in the world. We wouldn't have national borders, right? You'd be able to take your English skills and your psychology skills and your finance skills, and you'd be able to go anywhere in Europe or America and get a job that pays you more than you make in Colombia.
Which is really sad.
Yeah.
Like, because it doesn't make sense. Like, okay, to my people here, I'm worth something, and then if I live, I'm worthless.
Yeah, and it's also, it drives me crazy when people talk about the free market, but they don't admit that there isn't free movement of labor. Because pure free market theory says there's free market of goods, that you can grow, you know, eggplants and coffee in Colombia and sell it everywhere. And you can have free movement of capital, that you have investors from Canada who come invest in the new medical marijuana industry in Colombia. So capital can move and goods can move, but people can't move? Like, why not? If you're a free market capitalist, you should be in favor of no restrictions on immigration, except for maybe, you know, terrorists and criminals. Like, but other than that, let everything move freely, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're doing it without free movement of capital or without free movement of labor, like Colombia has very strict rules on moving money in and out of the country, which you know because you do like cryptocurrency investing. So it's like if you're restricting that, then you're creating these black market incentives. You're distorting the economy and you're distorting the, so to speak, optimal operation of the market, mm-hmm. which is a little bit of a digression from women and men, but it's
we always move a little from the...
Well, no, but it actually is relevant because if there's anyone who's more restricted in movement, it's usually women who don't want to leave. Women take on disproportionately the responsibilities of taking care of children, taking care of like old people, like their parents, grandparents, whatever. So that means you're more restricted in terms of where you can go because you want to stay near your grandmother because she needs your help.
That's something that I've been through, and I've been thinking about it a lot because, like I said before, in my family we're mostly women, and I have a grandmother and an uncle who need a lot of attention. And I have realized that that I don't work like every day, so I'm like the one in the family. I'm one of two of the grandsons who doesn't work on a daily basis.
One of the grandchildren.
Grandchildren, yeah.
In Spanish, do you say the grand?
Yeah.
What do you say, niños?
Nietos.
Nietos.
So, something I realized is that because I'm a woman, sometimes they expect more from me, more caring.
Expect more or assume that you'll do it?
Yeah, they assume that I'll do it, and they also, there's an expectation because of what I've done before. And I was thinking, okay, I have cousins, both women and men. We're mostly women. But I found myself thinking one day, if my cousin, if he's almost my age, he's 2 years younger, if he was on vacation and we needed him here,
mm-hmm.
they wouldn't really call him and ask him for
They wouldn't expect him to come back.
No.
But they would expect you to come back.
Of course. And would call women, not him. And then I was like, there are things that are wrong. Because we are humans, we have the same bodies, we can do the same things. And it's like, to care for someone, all you need is like the willpower and to be there.
Unless it involves nursing.
Yeah. But like in your family, like we were in the same conditions to take care of her or them.
You and your cousin.
Yeah.
But they expect you to do it.
Because I'm a woman. But they don't realize that. They don't see it. But I was seeing it.
You noticed it.
Yeah, I noticed it because it happened once. Like he had time, I had it, but they were calling me all the time. So I that's when it hit me like, oh, that's what they mean when they say out there, like, because there are more expectations on women on what they should be doing about caring,
mm-hmm.
taking care of the house, of the children, of their families. And there's not such a burden with men that would stop doing things. So I have found myself stalling from things like, I would like to go somewhere. Like in my case, I told my grandmother that I would like to leave the country. And she said, please don't do that to me. Like, who would take care of me? I'm like, oh my God. So I want to take this opportunity, and so I feel responsible for it.
When do you get to ever put yourself first?
So that had me thinking, okay, this is not right, and this is how sometimes other women feel inside their families, because there are certain responsibilities that they have, but someone else could do it too. They should be able to share them,
mm-hmm.
and feeling like, okay, I have this opportunity, but I have to consider these other things that I really shouldn't be considering. It's weird.
The way you're expected to balance it is like inherently unfair.
Yeah, that's when I really felt it, and that's what.
Right, and you're not even married with children yet.
No, I'm not. So I'm not supposed to be having these responsibilities. I love her. I love her deeply. That's why I go there so often and I take care of her. But that situation got me thinking, okay, this is what happened.
What would it look like if you were a man and given the sort of support and freedom to go? I mean, it works the other way too, is that men are expected to make money, period. And if we don't make money, we're like seen as not even full men.
Mm-hmm.
So we have less expectations on us to take care of other people in terms of caring, but more expectation in terms of making the money that supports everybody.
So there would be emotional caring and financial caring.
Something like, yeah. I mean, so there was a really funny video that my friend showed me that my friend is a single mother now of 2 daughters. And she's always actually made more money than her ex-husband. which is its own interesting thing. But she showed me this video, and it was so funny. So this woman starts complaining. It's like a YouTube video where this woman is complaining about how the expectations of her is always to be like, oh, how are you handling being both a mother and having a job, And so then she's complaining about this while she's doing the dishes, which was like really funny. And then she's like dropping plates on the ground and whatever. And it was like illustrating that like while men and women are both doing the same thing, somehow the woman's expected to also do the dishes and keep everything running and whatever. So she goes around with a microphone and she interviews random men in the street, like especially if they're like with their kid or whatever. Be like, hi, how do you handle being both a father and actually having a job? And every man was like, what? And then she was like, has anyone ever asked you that? And they were like, no. Like you. Like that's the only time. And every woman who has children and a job gets asked it like all the time. Like every day. Like, how can you be both how can you do it all? Like how can you be both a woman, like both a mother and have a job? And it's like this unfair question that women get asked all the time and men never get asked. So it was just really funny to see all these men be put on the spot being like, to do what? What? Like two things? I don't know. I didn't understand the question. I was like, I don't understand. Like, what's the point? What's your point? So there is something kind of ridiculous about that double standard.
Or what they say that is your husband helping you around in the house, or does he help you? Like,
right.
Does he help you? We live together, and it shouldn't be just like that because like I told you, I live with this kid, and it has.
You mean you have roommates?
Yeah, I have roommates and there's a kid in the house, and I think it really should we should encourage the idea that if you inhabit
a shared space,
it's your responsibility to take care for it. Period. No matter your age, your gender. That's it. Like something they say it happens in Japan. Like they teach children to take care of their schools and clean them, and the cleaning tasks for them are like, okay, this is my responsibility. So it got me thinking, like that's how we all should spread the word, like
to take full responsibility
for your house, and if you're married, that includes taking care of the kids.
It's interesting. So I've been to Burning Man a couple times, and part of the Burning Man ethic or morality is that everyone takes full responsibility, not just for themselves, but for like everything else. So like one of my friends, when I moved to Boston, I had an old friend who had become more involved in the burning community, and I didn't know much about it. I had been in Israel and I'd kind of missed. So when I first came back to America a few years ago, I was like, oh, I want to check out this Burning Man kind of scene. So my friend Steve throws this big party, invites me over, and he has a steam bath set up in his backyard. And like 100 people come over. And I'm like, Steve, aren't you worried about like, it's going to be a huge mess and you're going to have to clean up afterwards? And he's like, nah, it'll probably be nicer by the time everyone leaves. And I was like, no, because people are like getting drunk and maybe even doing drugs and like going out to this steam bath and bringing all sorts of food and barbecuing and whatever. But sure enough, like as the night went along, like people just took it upon themselves to like clean all the dishes, and like it's almost like this joke within the burner community that if you see something that needs doing, if you say it out loud, like, oh man, somebody should like fix those steps, people will be like, well, why don't you do that? Like you said it, like go do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like and it's so not the way most people are used to thinking. Most people are like, oh well, somebody else will deal with that.
And I didn't have the same education, but because I'm a scout. So one of the rules we had is in Spanish. Siempre deja un lugar mejor que como lo encontraste. Like always
leave the place better than you found it.
So, and I was very young when they taught me that. Like, so I've always had it.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? So it's also called the campfire rule. in English.
Yeah.
And
so you don't leave like anything there because it might set on fire or something like that?
Well, yeah, you leave the campsite better than you found it. So you pick up any garbage that you found, even if it wasn't yours and whatever. So Dan Savage, who's a sex advice columnist, he has a piece of advice about anyone who's dating somebody younger than them. He says, campfire rule.
We do that. Because women.
You should leave them better than you found them.
That's the thing that happens with women. We are always rehabilitating that. Is that the word we have? But
you're trying to help the man become a better...
But sometimes it's not as good. Like, it backfires on you.
Yes.
So that's the dangerous rule.
Mm-hmm.
It has like two sides, so I wouldn't take it there. But in terms of a house and your job and the world, like, that's how it is. Like, that's the real sense of not just community but belonging. Like, this is
that whatever community you're in or family, because in essence, when you're living with a group of people, it's de facto that's like your family structure. It's like you're taking care of your apartment with whoever you're living with. That's an interesting thing about sort of since the beginning of, let's call it feminism in the 60s. There's way more people living as single people into adulthood. That's like kind of a new thing in society. And I'm not saying it was better before, because before it was an awful lot of arranged marriages, unhappy marriages, culturally, different groups have different ways of doing things. We're probably better off in the sense that you have more freedom to not be in a shitty marriage, relationship, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have the structures in place, and I mean structures on many levels, financial, social, so to speak, even like the models in our brain of how to relate to each other to be single for most of adulthood, or for a lot of adulthood. That's like weird. Like no human society has ever like carried a large number of single people into adulthood like this. And I think there's been other societies where there wasn't a lot of marriage, but it was usually because those were slave societies or all sorts of other things where people couldn't become adults. And, it's also, we're not that good at choosing marriages. That's like a different thing. Like statistically, like, what is it? More than half of marriages end in divorce. And, the fact that we can choose our spouses doesn't mean we're actually any good at choosing. Right?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that's like a false freedom. It's like, oh, we got more freedom to do something, but we don't have any, I shouldn't say any, but we're not raised up with the tools and understandings and wisdom for how to be like that and do that.
It's weird because I thought of something funny that an Indian friend told me.
From India?
Yeah. He's from Canada, but he's Indian. To me, he's like half
culturally,
Indian. Yeah. And he said, okay, like many of my Indian friends, they come from arranged marriages.
Yeah.
So they're against it. And I was having this conversation and he was like, okay, I'm against it, but I have realized that I suck at finding a woman. So I told my mother if I hit, like, I think it was 33, if he... if he reaches that age, he was like, okay, Mom, I couldn't do it, set me up, okay, you do it. It seemed to work for you and my dad, so go and do it. I'm like, and I was thinking, this is funny, but it's weird in a way because, first of all, that's the example he had, okay, like, it could randomly work. But he should have, I don't know, like, trust in himself, like, he can do it. I don't know, it was kind of fun anyway because he was complaining about it and saying, okay, I'm willing to do it, like, as a desperate measure.
Right.
So I was like, oh, okay, if you want to, I hope you can find her sooner than that.
Well, I don't know if it's random either. Like, when families who are from the same culture arrange a marriage, right? They usually share a lot of cultural expectations and maybe religion.
Moral standards and
yeah,
ethics.
And an understanding of what a marriage looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what a house looks like and what inheritance looks like and a whole bunch of things. So in a way it might make it easier. Like it's not totally random, and in a way you're taking away the sort of instinct preference that humans very often get wrong, which is, oh, I'm attracted to this person, I'm attracted to this person. Like that's usually important for the first 6 months of how serious relationships work. But after 6 months, there's a lot of other factors that are more important. Like, are you good at communicating? Do you communicate in the same way? Are your values similar? Are your priorities similar? Is the kind of life that you want to build together similar? So that set of questions, it's like the families might actually be better at arranging in these arranged marriage cultures. I've seen that in parts of Judaism too. Is that like, oh, okay, this guy from this family and this woman from this family, like the families know them pretty well, and they say, you know what, these two could be a good match. It's like some of the dating apps. I suspect that a lot of the dating apps have a pretty good sense of which kind of people belong with which kind of people. They don't necessarily want to tell you, because if they actually put together people who actually fall in love and get married, like they run out of customers pretty quickly. It's like their business model is built on you. But it's true. I mean, you look at they're built on you being on the app and using it lots. If you use it and then you're done with it, what do you pay them, like a bounty? I don't think most of them work that way. Their incentives aren't in line with actually having it work out. I've heard that the state of Singapore is the country of Singapore is now getting into the dating game business, like dating apps, because they decided that their society wasn't having enough marriages and that they'd be better off if people were married and happy.
Oh my God, we're closer to Black Mirror every time.
Right. But in a way that could work, because they have a better set of incentives. They're not looking to make a profit on their dating app. They're looking for society to have more happily married couples, which pays off economically in all sorts of ways. So maybe that'll work in a way that these for-profit dating apps is not working.
Probably. Or there's something that is going on a lot now, and you see counselors or coaches talking about relationships and ways to get to know yourself better and values and that. So I don't know.
And you're trained as a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like, you would find guides for pretty much everything now. And I think that we could, and I'm interested in that, because I think about it like a guide to help people realize something about that I have learned that it's really important, and you said it before.
You mean like a dating coach kind of thing?
Probably, but it's about values. I have realized that if you can find a way to know the other person's values, or the order they have in his life,
the priority,
it's a way to know if you are going to work together or not. Because it's not just about values. It's like in which place are they in your life? Because one of the values in my life could be honesty, but if it's in the 5th place and yours is in first, it's there are better chances for me to lie.
Right. If you're so determined to be honest, there's a radical honesty movement, which I don't know if you heard about.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
There's this guy in America who has almost a cult around him, and he's radically honest. So it's oh, you look really tired today. If you say that in your relationship with a woman, the way our society works, it's usually not considered so nice, even though you might be being honest, right?
But if you're with someone who loves honesty,
yeah. I mean, ideally they love that level of honesty.
Someone like that, I could deal with something like that. So that's where I'm going. If you know the other person's value, if you take time. So I think that we need help, because with what happens with bringing up a child. Is that how you say it?
That works. Raising a child.
Raising a child. No one taught you how to do it. So, but now they have coaches and people who help them raise their children. So you could have someone focused on helping you how to get to know yourself and find someone else, find a couple. So I think there are ways.
That's interesting because it's like it comes back to this idea of caring professions. It's like helping people take care of other people, or it's almost like what does it mean to raise a child is like reproducing human beings. Like if an infant is born and is never taught anything, language, boundaries, values, anything, they're not really a human, they're like a blob. I mean, they might come out okay, but they might come out like really dysfunctional or violent or not be able to have good language skills or social skills, right? So it takes a lot of effort for many years to produce a human being, right? Humans are born way less developed than most other animals.
Mm-hmm.
We're born as like larvae. We're born as like these little helpless bundles that can't walk, much less function and take care of ourselves. You know, most other deer and I don't know, whatever, like within a couple days at
or
most.
hours sometimes, or minutes sometimes. They can just walk and.
Right, they get born and they're running away from a wolf, like right away. And humans, it's like for 9 months we're helpless, and for like 18 years we're still kind of relatively useless. Like, and we're not even expected to have good judgment. And there's actually some scientific evidence that we don't have a fully formed decision-making part of our brains until we're 25.
Frontal cortex.
Yeah. So reproducing human beings in each generation is like a huge amount of work that parents do the invisible work and women do the majority of. It's like reproducing human beings or reproducing culture. But we don't value that in any monetary sense, right? Like it's this very distorted way of structuring our lives is that like, I mean, I think in the West now it's a huge cost to have a child. Like each cost, they call it the social capital, is like wrapped up in like only, you know, 1 or 2, most 3 children on average. I think it's like the average is now less than 2. Each family puts so much of their stuff into their one kid and all these expectations, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars now in America or in Europe to raise a kid and put them through college and whatever. It's like this unbelievable amount of money before they become even a minimally productive. What does that mean, right? But like the math is not very logical. Like after years and years of school and teaching and whatever, you're just at the beginning making your own decisions about what career to follow and whether to have family, how to actually have relationships, what culture to live in, because apparently now we all choose kind of what combination of cultures we live in and where we live. But if we have freedom of movement, freedom of like, we don't seem to have a very logical way of growing up from being like little larva infants. We have a tremendous amount of freedom, but we don't have like much values that makes any sense collectively as a society.
Collectively, that's the point. And I don't know. No, we didn't. I didn't remember if we spoke about religion last time. Like,
Tiny bit, yeah.
But that's when I feel like religion does its part, and that's when thank you. I'm not a religious person, but I take my time to appreciate some of the aspects of religion, and that's one of the things I've seen. Like, it's good because when you belong to a religion, you have a base of values that helps you to build things, to make decisions or choices. So it's really good. And when we see these changing culture now, that more we're not like letting go of religions, like me saying I'm not religious, but my mother was, also leaves you there. Like, okay, so if I don't have that guidance, now I have to make the choosing. And what am I? Where am I going to do? So it's confusing, but I think that part of that is realizing that you're lost. You're like AA. There's
the first step is knowing that you
knowing that you
don't know,
you're lost, or you don't know, or
you're powerless.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting too, because anthropologically or historically, what is a religion, right? Like mostly that's an external definition. For the people inside it, they wouldn't say they're religious. Like if they're really inside it, they're just like, this is what we do. What do you mean? Of course, it's this time of year, so we all watch soccer games together. What's a soccer game? You know what I mean? Like trying to explain it to an alien, watching a soccer game is as much of a weird ritual as doing an animal sacrifice. I mean, doing an animal sacrifice, how is that any more religious than killing animals in a slaughterhouse and then having a nice dinner at a restaurant? Like they're both sort of weirdly ritualized ways that we go from this to this and do this and this, but we have beliefs embedded in how we do those things. Like in the West, most of the world today actually basically has a belief that killing animals is something that happens somewhere else, but then we all eat meat. But we buy it in nice packages in the supermarket, but we'll have a nice meal, or we won't, or we'll serve it to our grandchildren. You know what I mean? And that has a ritual component to it, even if nobody's calling it a religion. But so I question whether, like, because also Judaism is sort of a combination of a religion and a tribe and a group and a wisdom tradition. It's almost more like these American Indian tribes in the Amazon, that it's like we have a life cycle thing, but we don't have any core thing of beliefs. It's not like a creed the way Christianity or Islam are, that this is what you have to believe. In Judaism, it's a lot more amorphous. It's more about what you do and who you do it with and doing certain things together.
But do you have like values? You have shared values. Sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're not.
Yes, but I'm still not sure that those values are so, like for example, Jewish families tend to place a high value on education and on literacy. That we get trained how to read, and we have this ritual when we're 13 that you have to read in Hebrew from the Torah, from the Bible, the original Hebrew Bible. And historically, Jews are more educated than most of the people around. But not all people. And we're seeing in America in particular Asians, well, not all Asian groups, but Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Taiwanese, most of these East Asian groups value education in a way that's very similar to the way Jews are or were. Actually, Asians are even more intensely achieving now in schools and in tests and in getting into Harvard and all these things. Asians are doing even better than Jews are. And Asians are not unified by any religion. They have this set of values, but I think China, because of communism or whatever, they're almost all sort of officially atheist. And then like Japanese have kind of a mix of Shintoism, which is like a local, well, you could look up Shintoism, but some of them are Buddhist, some of them are nothing at all, some of them are a little bit Christian, but there's certainly no kind of like, oh, we have a religion. But somehow all of these different, and Koreans, a huge number of Koreans are very Christian, and then some of them are totally not. But somehow almost all of these Asian immigrants in America, East Asian immigrants, I guess Indians in America also, like academic overachievers, hardcore. But then certain Asian groups, the Hmong, I don't know how to pronounce it, one of the groups from Vietnam, sided with America in the Vietnam War, and I think 100,000 of them were allowed to come to America after the Vietnam War because they were on the losing side and they were America's allies, so they were allowed to resettle, I think mostly in Central California. And for whatever reason, they're not as education focused as a lot of these other Asian groups, and their socioeconomic pattern in America is more like a lot of the Hispanic immigrants to America who have a lot harder time. So it's not like religion and values and education aren't like the same thing. I don't know why.
But you're mentioning something that is real important, is that you have you have ways to learn about values.
Yes.
So you would do it in your family or in school or in under your religion, or the bigger would be the culture. So you mentioned religion. So we can say that from that it's like you would get your values or from your religion or your culture.
Yep.
Like your context would constantly be giving you information about what matters, what doesn't matter, what comes first, what comes second.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that religion has a big influence, but culture would always have the biggest because it like shelters everything else because
Or overshadows everything.
yeah, like
Or it surrounds you.
surrounds it.
It's like you live inside a culture.
So that's why we are always talking about the cultural values, like what's important for you, for your culture, in your country, or the ethnicity that you belong to. So sometimes it brings like a difference, but that's the bigger umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about gender differences and that's what we're trying to do as a culture because it would go beyond countries and beyond any other barriers. It's like let's change those values. So we had these values back in the 50s or in the 60s. We need to change them now in order to have this equality. So that's why the topic of values, I consider it so important to know which ones are the ones that belong to your culture or the ones you have and others have, and see how you can build something where we are aiming to this equality that we're talking about.
That's interesting because even aiming at equality is a value, and of course there's a huge difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. If you say that everybody should be equal in outcome, you're going down a very dangerous path because that's like Soviet communism, which most of us don't want equality of outcome when it comes to like who sorts out to become a neurosurgeon. You know what I mean? If anyone could just be like, oh, I want to be a neurosurgeon, but they're not actually good at school or med school or fine motor skills, they're probably not the one you want to operate on you. The one you want to operate on you is the one who came out at the top of the hierarchy, and he or she is like really good at knowing everything about brain chemistry and anatomy and all this stuff. So we don't want equality of outcome in that. We want everyone to have an equal chance, maybe, to become a neurosurgeon if they want to, but we don't want there not to be a meritocracy of who becomes the best at those type of things, like airline pilots and neurosurgeons, and you don't want like anyone to just be like, oh, I want to fly the plane today. Like, I don't think that's a good idea.
But I think we have filters. Like when you're looking for a job, you would have to show your experience, like the way you have been doing your education and your references. And sometimes in that path, you can see which professional is good at something and who isn't. So we find ways to realize who's good at something and who isn't.
Right, but that means that we don't value equality of outcome. We value something more in that context. The person who's going to do the better job, or the person who's going, like, equality of outcome can't be the highest value.
No.
That's a very dangerous thing. And that's where I think you have this idea of like, we're working towards equality since the 60s. Well, there's good reason for a lot of people to be conservative when they say like, wait a second, like, we have a world that isn't perfect, but it's also pretty amazing. Like, we have a context of meaning, and we have a culture, and we have a context where we could be expressed. And maybe it could be a little better, but if we try to do radical changes, we could break the whole thing.
But either way, there's no way to make them like radically, because
make those changes radical.
There's no way, because you like naturally every change happens like step by step, and you would need a dictator to go and say, okay, this is what happened. And even if you had someone like that, you would have a force that would come and say, would fight you because
they don't want that change to happen. But we do sometimes make those changes radically and quickly. That's what these revolutions are. You know, sometimes the change happens quickly, like the world wars that we've had, and like I think in America, 1919, like right after World War I, was then it was like women were just like, hey, we played this huge role in the home front while the war was happening, and so now we demand the right to vote. And that was like a really radical change. It wasn't a given. I think in Switzerland they didn't give women to vote until like the 50s or maybe even later. I don't know. My friend was making fun of the Swiss recently because they didn't fight in the world wars, so it was like, oh, I guess they didn't have the pressure that the other countries had to be like, oh, I guess we need to give women the vote now because we're fighting these wars.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Fighting wars sometimes makes women have less power, but who knows? I mean, here, when did women get the vote? It was also like...
I have to Google it, but I know it was late.
It was late
Mm-hmm.
in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And Colombia hasn't had a very functional democracy.
That's a very...
It's an understatement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean... So changes can happen radically, though, was my point. Like, change can happen very quickly, and I guess...
But the outcome of that, like, not always is good. Like, when they...
Right, sometimes it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And even the change that you try to impose, if you say everybody has to do this, like land reform or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that now there's like equality of everybody getting like a good, fair farm. It just means that like a different group of people wind up getting all the big farms, right? I think that's what happened in a lot of the areas of Colombia that got taken over by the guerrillas, right? The guerrilla groups.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they like took over and they said, all the big landlords get, killed or redistributed, and then, but within a few years, it just becomes a different kind of inequality.
And it's, they're also trying to change that, but I wouldn't dare to talk about it because it's that very big.
It's so complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Of what happened here in Colombia. Because I also understand that in Colombia, a lot of the guerrilla groups did have much more male-female equality in certain ways.
In the guerrilla groups?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think so.
You
Because
don't think so?
if you go and look more into it, they would say, okay, I was raped, I was being abused, I was being put in this situation, like in the kitchen, or taking care of the kids, or like, it's the same thing. It's just in a different location, but it's the same thing. So, that's not how really it happened.
Yeah, I've read about some of the studies of like the Amazonian tribes before they got taken over by civilization. That the anthropologists said that some of them had these things where there was always raids on the different villages, and like maybe the men from one village would come raid another village, and they'd kill the adult warriors, and they'd take the women to be their wives in their own village. And it was like the women were just kind of like, oh, okay, well, it's the same here as it was there. And it wasn't necessarily like this huge transition. It was like, women are going to be treated as women in whichever tribe, so now we're in a new tribe. Okay. And I think that's been a lot more true of women throughout history than the dominant view of history is this group won, this group won, this group won. But from a women's perspective, it's kind of like, well, one group of men dominating us versus another group of men dominating us, and not that much changes. So I wonder how much has changed since the 60s, whether that's really much different.
I don't know. Because I haven't been through that situation.
You haven't been carted off by a group of marauding warriors? Even if they were good dancers?
Thank God I haven't.
Yeah.
No. So again, what would be the conclusion to you? Like,
I don't know. I feel like there's a level of looking at, quote, what the problem is that hasn't been thought about this way before. That like, what the dominant narrative is, since the 60s is that like there's left wing and right wing, there's liberal and conservative. But I'm not sure that really maps to the way changes have actually been playing out. Like, and in some ways, I think since the early 70s, like, this is a different topic to some extent, but like from the 1890s through the 1960s, every 10 years was like totally wild new technologies and changes in the world. Like, go back to the 1880s and people were still, dying of basic diseases. They didn't know what antibiotics were or anything like that, right? And every 10 years there'd be like some huge improvement. You had penicillin, you had sanitation, and we learned how to purify water. Actually, I learned about the first famous woman scientist at MIT was the pioneer in creating water filtration systems. every 10 years you'd have like some huge innovation like that, and then you had the bicycle, and then you had the car, and then you had the airplane, and then you had, modern chemistry, and then fertilizers, and suddenly you could have, chemical fertilizers, and all of a sudden most of the world wasn't on the brink of starvation. And then you have, jet planes, and then you have atomic power and solar power, and, every 10 years. And then by the 60s, 50s, we go into outer space, and in the 60s, we go to the moon. And in the 70s, we, I don't know, go home, like, argue about things. Like, progress kind of stopped in a lot of meaningful ways. And since the 70s, what we've mostly seen is a lot of the rest of the world caught up to, like, America and Western Europe in terms of, like, standards of living, and, like, everyone has cars now. And, the way Colombia looks now is probably not that different from the way New York looked in 1967 or something. But there really hasn't been this progress in the way that we were seeing for the 60, 80 years before that. It's kind of stalled out.
I think the speed changed, but there are things happening. But what I think is that we were used to a certain speed, or not we, like history, because I wasn't there for
a speed of improvement.
I think things have changed,
Mm-hmm.
and we have now a small progress and small inventions, but not as big as groundbreaking.
Well, by some arguments, it's like we're moving into almost like a new kind of feudalism. That rather than like continuous progress, now we're seeing a lot more consolidation into like huge finance. That like, it's more about like fitting into the way the world is and sort of getting a job that might be kind of bullshit, but that's part of this like financial system, rather than continuing to really innovate and progress. That's what some people are saying, and I think there's some truth to it, is that like really innovative ideas kind of get squashed. Like I've been hearing about this like personal helicopter, like that you could have your own like little flying bicycle. Since like 1999 they had like invented one, and it like cost like only like $10,000 to make. It was like a lawnmower sized motor, and somehow it's like disappeared. I can't find the archives about it anyway. I read about it in Wired magazine. So like part of me thinks that like somebody with a lot of money decided to squash the kinds of innovations that really could change things. So I have like these suspicions. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I know there's some things that are not sort of like fully known to the world, right? So sometimes I feel like debates about feminism or racism or whatever are sort of distractions from like, hey, there's a much bigger thing going on right now about all of humanity that might be a lot more important for us to focus on.
Which would be?
Well, are we actually all getting the full story of what our options are as a society, as civilization? Are we actually getting agency to like make those decisions? Like, I don't think Colombia is really a functional democracy.
I don't think so either.
Like, you have a couple choices, but like, who chose your choices? And America's even worse. You just get two crappy choices that like nobody's happy with. Like, most of us don't have any real voice and in deciding what technologies get put out or don't get put out. Most of us don't have a real voice, and I feel like that's where a lot of the focus should be, is like, how do we actually make decisions? How do we get the information to make the decisions? And it's like the priorities and the values of how we decide what the problems are. I don't know if that's a very hopeful takeaway, but that's where I'm going with it.
It's a big one.
Any final thoughts?
I think that it's not that what we have been discussing is like a distraction. To me, there are many things going on outside,
Mm-hmm.
and we should take the time to think about them,
Mm-hmm.
and to build the spaces to think about them, so we take our responsibility into what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be just considering that there are many things out there, and just think about this one, and that one. Just don't ignore what's out there. But I don't think it's like a distraction. It's because it's really important. We're talking about rights and access to think and to things, and the way culture sees you. So
So in a way, you're saying that talking about the way we have rights for the way we treat women, the way we recognize and value work, these are some of the most important specifics of the bigger thing I was saying, which was how do we have access to information about our choices?
No, I think they are all there.
They're all
out there, and
they're all at that level of importance.
to me, because like what you're saying, is access to information or to options. That would be the same. Not in a way. It's something that we're talking about when we're talking about feminism and women's rights.
Is that women are told they don't have options.
So what you're saying is like, okay, in this conspiracy theory, which it is,
A little bit.
like, do you realize how much information we're missing? Some things that we didn't know about, decisions that are being made by others. It happens in other fields too. Like in this field that we have been discussing about, which is feminism. It's like if you use the same questions, it is happening inside in the micro. So I think there's something, I don't remember the name of this philosopher, but like when as it is inside, it's outside, as it is in the small, it is in the big picture. So when we are discussing little things, sometimes we are discussing the bigger picture.
That small issue reveals the bigger picture. Yeah, that's fair. I like that.
So that's my point.
Thank you all left in.
Bye, thank you.